Hello, everyone, and welcome to what I guess we could say at the start is just a conversation about religion, prompted by Richard Dawkins' interview with Joe Rogan. I'm here. My name's Greg Watkins. I teach in a humanities program at Stanford University. I've been doing that for a while, so I work with young people studying philosophy, religion, literature. And I'm here with my daughter, Erica.
Hello.
Do you want to say a little bit about who you are and what you're up to?
I have been traveling the world for a few years after dropping out of college and exploring alternative lifestyle choices.
Right? Yep. And part of the backstory, so I'm going to do a little bit of backstory because I'm hoping this fits into some other projects and becomes not just a one-off thing, which I'll say more about. But one of the things in the background is that you and I have actually recorded conversations before called Father-Daughter Philosophy Talk when you were 10, maybe? Mm-hmm. So we would try having conversations, and which I thought were fun and productive about basic philosophical ideas. So one thing is father-daughter getting back together to talk, have more such conversations. The other background thing is I have, as Erica knows, been working on a podcast series called A Shareable World with a guy named Big Mike. And that podcast series is introducing the history, theory, and practice of democratic socialism. But I think the overarching idea of a shareable world, of finding our way into a future where the people of the world can share this world one way or another, that this conversation about religion actually fits under that umbrella too. So I think how we understand religion and how it works in the world is super important to figuring out how we all get along. And then we also, Erica, you and I have been talking about this idea that springs up partly from your interest in veganism and partly my interest in Joe Rogan's podcast. So I'll just say first that I'm a great admirer of that podcast and what Joe has done for cultural discourse, really. And if nothing else, just his open mind to general inquiry, his willingness to talk to any guest and in a long conversation format is just hugely important. But in our conversations about veganism, I started thinking about kind of what I call, what would I call it? Just categories, like categories of thought, because I do this in my teaching as well, and kind of had this preliminary idea that sometimes we're talking about facts of the world, sometimes we're talking about our beliefs, and sometimes we're talking about value. And then I started listening with that ear to Joe Rogan podcasts and noticed that there's a slippage often between those three different things that confuses conversations. I'm talking a lot. Do you want to add anything to that? No?
Sounds
We're okay? Good. Okay. So there's this other project of, could there be some kind of supplement to a Joe Rogan conversation where somebody like me and in conversation with somebody like you walk through a conversation they had about a tricky topic and try to point out where and when, what kind of thinking is happening and how one might make decisions about their own facts, values, and beliefs and about whatever issue is being discussed. So when it comes to veganism, we've had these conversations where we've tried to sort out what is a factual claim related to the vegan diet, what is belief, what is value, etc. And then, as I was telling Erica yesterday, Joe Rogan has this podcast called Fight Companion, where he gets together with buddies and they just talk while they're watching a UFC fight. And so have this idea that we could call this thought companions, where we talk, where I have a conversation about what came up in a particular podcast. So In this case, Richard Dawkins was kind of famous figure for his promotion of atheism, a certain attitude towards religion. He's an evolutionary biologist. I really, honestly, actually haven't read much that he's written, but I kind of feel like I know the position he takes. And so suddenly there was this opportunity, and since I study religion, my PhD is in religious studies, I just became particularly impassioned about everything I think he's getting wrong or missing about how we think about religion. So here we are. That's, I think, the prelude.
Perfect.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You listened to the podcast separately from me. We haven't really talked about it. So I did want to ask just if you came away with general impressions of that guy or what that conversation was leading you to think about.
I didn't. I think growing up with you, I am similar to you in the fact of being open to different ideas or open to thinking about things. And I actually didn't think it was a very deeply moving, thought-wise podcast, just because Richard Dawkins is so set in his thinking.
Right.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say anything stood out to me, but I definitely have thoughts about particular.
So I'm not looking for anything in particular, but like when you say set in his thinking, like what would you point to?
Just when he said things like, well, of course there's not a light after death, or...
Right.
And he would say, wouldn't you think that? Kind of...
Yeah.
To Joe Rogan, like stating things that he thought were obvious that might not be to other people.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the things I've come to think in general about problems our culture faces, and just like, what does it mean to have an open mind, that there's a value one can cultivate of just kind of intellectual humility, which I think Joe Rogan has a lot of. Just outright calling himself dumb a lot, like just just having saying like, I have stuff to learn. And you're right. I think if nothing, Richard Dawkins' views aside, he's kind of seems kind of set in his ways. Yeah. So he's out to, and so one thing you can call that is a kind of dogmatism or ideological position. And so I think we're looking for the richer conversation and push back a little bit against Dawkins. Okay, well, and so then just to say how this what I'm after in this conversation is to present to you, and you can help me along the way and tell me what you think. But I there are certain kinds of views of religion that I want to get across. And I think they're missing from Dawkins' worldview, and I think they complicate his view in the right ways. And so we're just kind of walk through those and then try to make reference to the Dawkins conversation along the way. And it's a lot. I'm a little worried about getting how if we're going to have enough time for everything that I think it'd be fun to cover. But one place I wanted to start is what I call some problems with Dawkins, kind of on his own terms. And so, this is kind of criticism of Dawkins, just the way he thinks in the conversation, versus what I'm kind of most excited about, which is a kind of more positive presentation of what religion is up to. And I do think he can be a bad example of not being good at sorting out fact, value, and belief. Mm-hmm. That he, and in some ways, there's a kind of nutshell version of what I think he's up to, and what's wrong with it actually is he likes to pick fights with religious worldviews that make claims to facts about the world. So one example of this, easy example, is how old is the world? So the Bible, for example, could say it is, 6,000 years old or whatever. Science says, no, it's that's just flat wrong. here's how we should think about the age of the world. Here's how we would come to figure it out. And then he's making the mistake of taking that factual dispute, which we'll talk more about, and translating it to the belief and value sphere. So what does that, if Christians or Jews or whoever takes the Bible as sacred are mistaken about the age of the world, then they're therefore mistaken about the whole thing. And then he also lays over this kind of fight about fact, his own values, about how one should think about the world. And that's where I think we get into confusions about what science can and cannot say about how we live our lives. But he's conflating a certain, what I'll call a scientistic worldview. So we have the scientific method, but we also have a way of looking at the world that does involve belief and value, that kind of looks at science as kind of the ultimate arbiter of how we should think about the world. So he has his own values that he slides in there, and so I'm hoping to sort some of those out. And then I think he also, and this came up in the conversation, he's a reductionist. Mm-hmm. And at one point, Joe says, he's like, reductionism. And Dawkins says, yep, nothing wrong with, do you remember that?
Yeah.
And indeed, one has to evaluate reductionism, has to see that it's happening, and then has to decide if you reduce. So what reductionism is taking some phenomenon and saying it is nothing but this other thing. So you reduce the vast complexity of religion, and you say, well, it's nothing but a story to help us explain natural phenomenon, or nothing but something to make us feel better about death. Or, all right, we're doing okay with you so far? Another thing he does that drives me a little nuts is he takes extreme examples to be representative of religion. You're nodding your head. Do you remember any of those?
Well, they did talk a little bit about like Mormonism, or like, I didn't know one of the religions he was talking about, but it was like a train cult.
Oh, cargo cult.
Cargo cult.
Right, which we may not get into, but those are fascinating. Right.
But just extreme levels of religion that.
Yep. No, exactly. So he's taking Mormonism, which has its own, and they talked a little bit about where the plates came from and kind of the factual stuff behind that, ignoring what else religion might be doing. And actually, by the way, I want to make sure I say I'm a great lover of science, and I think this culture needs to be more scientific and needs to come to terms with what science tells us about what's going on around us. So it's not to criticize science. This is where we're out to talk about the limits of science. But so in taking these extreme examples, there also was the Westboro Baptist Church woman. And then he also talked about the killing of gay people in certain Islamic countries, which he slid right over to say must be a value of these religions. So that struck you as strange on the face of it?
I mean, a bit crazy. I mean, you can't, I guess, be reductionist about it and say that the extreme ways of thinking shape the average way of living in religious alignment.
Yeah, so they're extreme in the sense that they might be outliers, and for me, it's also they're extreme in the sense that they're actually may be an even richer way to know what religion's doing, that they are outside of, actually. So that's, again, just kind of a point about Dawkins himself. And we touched on this a little bit. There's what I call scientism. A lot of people, it's not my term, but scientism is when you take the scientific worldview, which I like to think of as more of a method of figuring out something about the physical universe in a testable, repeatable way, and then moving that over to a worldview that tells you in advance what is possible and not possible, what is valuable and not valuable, which in a way is against science, because science should have an open mind about those things. I don't want to keep quizzing you, but do you remember any examples of that kind of thing? So do you remember anything about what he said about homeopathy?
He said that it just can't be true, because
Right.
if it was true, then they would win the Nobel Prize in physics or something.
So it's a very curious statement for a scientist to say it can't be true. At the same time that as a scientist, you should be open to the possibility of it being true. Mm-hmm. So for those who don't understand the basics of homeopathy, and this is his complaint, and it's truly a weird thing that homeopathy is claiming, that by taking a increasingly small amount, diluting over and over again a remedy, you dilute it so much that the remedy you're taking may not have a single molecule of the actual thing. It may be all water. So that indeed goes against our understanding of the physical world and how, whether you need a molecule or not, et cetera. So it's a very confusing thing, but it's also this thing that has had this long history, and it's a kind of practice, and it has been, there are some scientific studies which show that it might be having an effect, and we'd have to get into the placebo business too, which we'll come back to later. But if you were open-minded as a scientist, you'd want to study it, and you'd also be open to the possibility of your understanding of the rules of the universe being rewritten, because that's what happens in science all the time. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have a chance to go look at this, and so I'm only saying it in passing as an example, but there was a physics study recently, past 3 years maybe, very, very, done rigorously by actual physicists, that showed that water held a kind of memory of what was with it recently. So if Dawkins wants to grant the Nobel Prize for that, then maybe that'll happen. But the point is, there may be some actual evidence from physical science that water has some kind of special property of being able to hold this kind of structural memory of something that was diluted in it. And then I think he's also scientistic, and or maybe just a bad scientist when it came to psychedelics. So do you remember what Dawkins' position was about psychedelics?
He just said he wouldn't do it because he had recommendation from somebody who had before that a bad trip is not worth anything else that you could encounter. Right. And just that he might do it on his deathbed once. Right. But hasn't decided.
Yeah. And Joe asked a lot of great questions about that. And Joe's, of course, people who know, is a psychonaut, so he's been willing to enter that territory. And I think it will come back to it, I hope. Psychedelics have something to say about this issue of religion. But it also just struck me as, here's a guy who says he's a scientist. He says he has a deep interest in consciousness. And while it's true that psychedelics can lead to bad trips, and there are a lot of things to consider, and they should be done right, and so on and so forth, it strikes me as odd, and so I'm being critical of Dawkins himself, since we're still in that part of the show, for not having more of an open mind about that. Yeah.
Well, it also struck me as a little bit of something like religious people might encounter too, is this fear of something horrible, and therefore acting throughout their lives in a way that might avoid that. Like, for example, hell and living in. Right. For me, it felt like that was quite a religious position to take. Right. Of like, I won't be doing it because of the fear of what my own consciousness might go through, rather than like my body or my.
Right. Yeah, and I might even add a perhaps subconscious fear that it would actually challenge in a deep way his own understanding of reality. Okay, well, we'll hopefully come back to that. And then the last thing, and this is more just me being interested myself in the history of ideas and the flow of ideas, especially in the West, and teaching in this class where thoughts change over time. He talked a little bit about thoughts changing over time. Do you remember that part? This maybe jumps out at me because he was talking about how values change.
Okay.
No,
Go for it.
Yeah, okay. So he was talking about, he was trying to make a claim about religion becoming less popular and about values. He said, 100 years ago, the values were different. He talked about Lincoln, Huxley, I can't remember who else, but how some of their views, if they were the progressives, their views would be different now. And he just has this really weak explanation for that. He says it's something in the air. And he talked about conversation and parliaments and I just, since this is more my expertise, it all, if I were to talk about science, he would probably find, or evolutionary biology, he'd probably find me laughable. But when he's talking about the history of ideas, I think he's really underestimating what the role of religion is in those. And he has no theory himself about why and how things change.
Right.
And I think that is part of the bigger story here about religion. All right, we're going to head into what now I call the positive project, where we're going to talk about different ways of looking at religion that I think he's overlooking. So the first point, and this is one I believe deeply, and it comes from things I've studied, which we'll talk about, is that religion is a fundamentally human thing. And I thought Joe was great at continuing to bring that up and just saying along the way, but doesn't this seem to be what human beings do? And what is it? And why do we act this way? And Dawkins, I think maybe has some evolutionary biological ways of thinking about that. But they're not very rich, very deep. And there's a lot for people who study religion seriously. There's a lot of ways to think about it that Dawkins isn't bringing to the table. And Joe, again, has the good sense to ask about, but doesn't necessarily have his own ideas about that either. One, I want to mention one thinker in particular, psychologist, social scientist, American from the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. William James is his name. You ever heard that name?
No.
He was at Harvard. He was part of this new science of psychology. And he wrote a very big book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where as a scientist, so not as a believer, he's approaching this scientifically. And that's another thing I think Dawkins doesn't get, is that in the human realm, in the realm of culture, his brand of science doesn't work as well. That if you're gonna look at what humans do, there's a lot of kind of scientific thinking that can happen that Dawkins isn't necessarily prepared to do. So William James was one of these people, and it's maybe 500 pages long. He does all these case studies, looks at people. He talks about conversion a lot. How does somebody go from being an alcoholic to not being an alcoholic, from being a good person to being a gambler? How do we change? And what does it tell us? And a lot of the examples of change involve religion. And actually, so that's a little introduction to William James, but the main point I want to make here is that the subtitle of this book is A Study in Human Nature. And William James, from his own study of religion, says at one point, I couldn't find the quote, but it is, I'm pretty sure it's as direct as this. He says, "You cannot understand what it is to be human if you don't understand religion." It's just, they are inextricable from William James' point of view. That's clearly not Dawkins' view, so there's something to sort out there. All right. Any questions about that or comments about that? So the first, so there's a point about religion and being human. It's a very general point, but we have a lot of content to put in there, like we don't know what that is yet. And in fact, Dawkins himself, in a way, might say, well, yeah, sure. For example, the tribalism.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, what he said.
Well, I think this goes into the facts, values, beliefs way of sorting things out, because I think we have a disagreement culturally about what religion means, and I can't define it exactly, and maybe you can. But I know I have a mom who's kind of anti
yes, she is.
religion. But I would say she's kind of a religious person, the way she goes about life. So he might say, oh, well, religion is this, but tribalism is another thing. Or creating stories about life is a separate thing.
Yep.
But for other people, maybe that is one and the same.
Right.
So that just kind of lays out why people might not agree on things when they're actually thinking of the same.
Right.
They're just having different definitions for what a word means.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's super important, I think, as Joe knows too in all his many conversations, that how we define words is just crucial. It's like, are we talking at cross purposes or not? And again, just to reiterate, I think when Dawkins says religion, he means claims about the factual nature of the universe. Our example of how old is something, for example, how old is the earth? So, and he thinks all the other stuff religion does is just built on top of that. And that's part of what I want to overturn or complicate.
Or is separate from the religious part. Because to me, it seemed like he saw the need for a tribal way of looking at things, or the desire to create stories about our life. And he sees that as a valid way to be human.
Right.
And that's how it came across to me. But not being religious about it.
Yeah.
Which seemed contradictory to me, because to me, those are similar things.
Yeah. Okay, good. So that's something we'll hopefully sort out a little bit more. But I can't let this pass without asking you, in what way do you think Mom's religious?
She has very I can't think of how to say this, because I know she'll probably listen one day.
Hopefully.
I'm trying to think of synonyms for religious. I'm assuming we're going to edit some of this.
Probably not.
Okay.
No, we have to struggle for words sometime. And I'm wondering if what we talk about later will actually echo some of what you say. And that's why I'm interested I'd like to force you to try to give it some language. She
has beliefs that even if you were to give her other evidence suggesting that those beliefs are not true, it wouldn't shift her way of thinking of those beliefs. To me, that's kind of a religious thing.
I see.
Thing to do is like when you have, if nothing can prove it wrong, then to me it's a belief.
Right.
But she also has like habits and ritual in her own way.
Yeah.
Like
right.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think of other ways that she's religious, but to me, she's deeply religious about her life.
As we talk, if it occurs to you, oh yeah, that's part of what I was thinking with respect to Mom. Go ahead and bring that back, because you're right. She is kind of well, without talking about the religious part, she is in a sense a Dawkins atheist. That I think one of her beefs against religion is that it will make claims about fact and then try to derive value from them. And she just thinks that's misguided somehow.
Well, I was hoping she wouldn't listen to the Richard Dawkins thing, because I think his argument about that Joe Rogan said was a home run when he said everybody else is atheist too, just not to one, or, I'm just atheist to one more God than you are.
Right.
To her, it's like, I think that would make her more atheist.
That'd be a home run for her too.
Yes.
Right.
Just because I think she thinks like everybody's crazy, but I'm the only one who's not.
Right.
I just, yeah.
Yeah.
That sounded very Mom to me when he said that.
Right. I actually really hope we come back to that point, although it's kind of low on my priority list. But I think, let me just say here that I think the things we talk about should put that home run into a new perspective. So if you remember it, bring it up a little bit later.
Okay.
I can say more why. So, okay, let's turn to, I think, a hugely impactful thinker. It cleared up a lot for me in terms of how to think about these things. I've just always been fascinated. I mean, my personal story, I did have a kind of Christian conversion when I was maybe 12. But it didn't last long. And I'm fascinated by religion ever since. I mean, I got a PhD in it. So there's a kind of little mystery there of what attracts me if I'm not myself religious and adherent to any particular religion. So this guy's name was Schleiermacher.
Cool.
So he was a German of the early 19th century. So he's in Berlin. He's a Christian. He was what's known as a pietist, which is a very kind of very intense-oriented Christianity, a lot of prayer, a lot of meditation, a lot of singing probably. I actually don't know a ton about the pietists, but that word piety is about an attitude. Do you know that word?
I've heard it used before, but I
being
wouldn't
pious.
trust myself to define it for you.
So it's like, piety is just showing a lot of respect towards something and the sanctity of it. And so it's a kind of emotional thing, which will play into what I'm about to say. But that's his background. And he's a pastor. He works in a hospital. He gives sermons. So he's super Christian, but also super smart and super interested in culture in general. So this was one of those places in Europe where they had these things called salons where, people would get together and talk about ideas and art and religion. So he had very good friends who were poets, well-known romantic poets that people still read today. Very good friends with philosophers who themselves were anti-Christian, had become anti-Christian. And there was a lot of problems with the church, and there was an exciting time in terms of the change of culture. There was a scientific revolution in philosophy. Art was becoming not so Christian anymore, not so religious. And they would give Schleiermacher, who they adored and was a great conversation partner, they would just give him a hard time about, you got to drop this Christian stuff. So they push him to write this series of essays called On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers. So speeches just means he wrote little chapters, and the cultured despisers are these philosophers, scientists, and poets. And so he basically says to them, you give me a hard time about my Christianity, and you are missing something crucial, which is you are missing what I, Schleiermacher, think is the most important piece of being a Christian or being religious. He talks generally about religion, even though he's Christian himself. And so I'll tell you that he says it's really about feeling. And this comes back to that piety thing in his own kind of Christian upbringing, but I think is crucially important for thinking about what religious people are interested in when they're religious. So it kind of shifts the conversation to this feeling level of being human. And I'll tell you more, is a specific kind of feeling he has in mind. But he actually does something very helpful, especially as it relates to Dawkins, in explaining this to these other people. He says to them specifically, look, you think religion is about metaphysics. And now metaphysics is his word for the factual description of the world, like what is the makeup of the universe. And in a very progressive way for Schleiermacher's time, he says religion is not about metaphysics, not about science, not about factual claims, even though that happens a lot in religion. Like our example is, how old is the earth? And Schleiermacher says specifically, religion shouldn't be in competition with science about those kinds of questions. So he concedes the whole, to me, everything Dawkins is standing on. So by conceit, I mean, he says, yep, you tell us how old the earth is. Don't think you've gotten close to what religion is by taking that away. And we're going to talk a little bit more about, I think there's a very complicated story about why those metaphysical things are part of religion. But at the moment, he's trying to distinguish this feeling business. And then he also says, and it's not about morals, which is a striking radical claim, even today, right? I think a lot of people would say religion is about, I think this came up a little bit in the podcast.
Did. Yeah.
That religion is where we get our moral values. And I guess they talked about whether you can have them without religion.
Yeah, because me and Emily, my sister, talked about that.
Yeah.
Just because she said, oh, well, that's crazy to me when people say that.
Yeah.
But for me, because I lived in Missouri, I heard that a lot.
Right.
Well, where do you get your belief system from? How do you decide what's right and wrong?
Yeah. Yep, totally.
So it wasn't shocking to me that was a perspective, but.
Yeah. So, and again, of course, morality is a deep part of actual religious practice. But here's Schleiermacher saying the essence of religion is not the metaphysical stuff, not the moral stuff. Put those two things aside. It's about feeling. And he uses the word also intuition and feeling. And he says it's a particular kind of feeling. So I'm going to read a little quotation. In my words, he says it's about, he has this phrase, the intuition of the infinite. So he thinks, and by the way, he says this is part of being human. So he's like James, who comes, maybe 100 years later in America. So here he is in Germany at the start of the 1800s. And part of this big shift, which is part of what's in the air that Dawkins doesn't really have more to say about, is this idea that we should think about religion not from the perspective of here's a Christian Bible telling you how to live, but he comes at it from the human side and says, here's this human need. Here are these religions that fulfill it. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just wondering, that makes me think that would serve Richard Dawkins' perspective about it, because it is a human desire.
Yep.
Therefore, that means that it's actually not a religion that's doing that. It's a human thing that's doing that.
Good, great. And so you could be reductionist with respect to feeling. So you say, oh, all that religious stuff, it's really just this human feeling thing, and therefore, all that other stuff doesn't. Is that what you mean? Like
if it's a human thing, I don't need religion to feel that.
Right.
Therefore, religion is, I don't need it.
Okay, good. So hold on to that thought. We're going to talk more about that. So let me just read this. I have, I think, 3 quotations. The first one is about the point about it being human. And so here he is, this German guy in the early 1800s. He says, I wish to lead you, my poet, philosopher, scientist friends, to the innermost depths from which religion first addresses the mind. I wish to show you from what capacity of humanity religion proceeds, and how it belongs to what is for you the highest and dearest. So he's saying 2 things. He's saying deep human capacity that addresses the mind, and he's also making this surprising claim, and this is mostly to the poets, I think. I should emphasize the poets more here. He's saying this is something you yourself care deeply about. And so to come back to the question you just raised, he is, at least at this point of the argument, he's saying, dear poet friends, that thing you get excited about in poetry is happening in religion as well. Okay, and so then the next quotation, maybe I'll just read it and we'll see what it adds, but this is a little bit about the metaphysics and the morals. So he also, if we think about human capacity, we have the capacity to think, we have the capacity to act, and we have the capacity to feel. So thinking goes with metaphysics. That's what Dawkins loves to do, is think about the world. Acting goes with morality. And then he's trying to etch out this space that's not the whole conversation. Human beings feel as well. So he says, religion's essence is neither thinking nor acting, but intuition and feeling. It wishes to intuit the universe, wishes devoutly to overhear the universe's own manifestations and actions, longs to be grasped and filled by the universe's immediate influences and childlike passivity. So to come back to what you were saying before about Dawkins maybe liking this emphasis on human feeling, Schleiermacher's adding to feeling, because we all feel like that. There's nothing surprising about pointing out feeling, but he's saying religion is about a particular feeling about the universe as a whole, about how do we relate to everything. And this could derail us a little bit, but one way of thinking about what human beings do as meaning creators, as having language and culture, is that we are aware of the whole as a whole. Like I would make the argument other animals don't have that awareness.
I'm not sure. I agree.
So we could go into a discussion of that, but it's certainly true that you just have to reflect that we think about the whole, like the concept of the universe. And so Schleiermacher is saying there's a feeling component to that. There's an intuition component to that, there's some kind of exchange. Here's Dawkins trying to describe the factual nature of the world, but Schleiermacher is saying that's not the whole story. We're also looking to be in a feeling relationship to the whole as a whole. And by the way, I think Joe Rogan, and I don't think it really came up in this podcast, but I think he has this sensibility very deeply, as I think a lot of most people do. I don't know if you've ever heard I know you've listened to some other podcasts where he talks about the impact of living near the ocean. Have you ever heard him talk about that?
It does ring a bell. Yeah.
He thinks it has a kind of tempering effect on people, that when you're near the ocean, you experience its vastness. You experience you as a single person of a limited space in this particular time as set up against this vast, ancient, powerful thing. That, Joe Rogan, is a religious sentiment. That is, at least from Schleiermacher's point of view, is that feeling. So the scientists can be there saying, well, that's a lot of water and it's this big and it's that deep, and but that doesn't touch the feeling part.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of how like people my age would approach that, who say they're not religious and they deeply believe in science, would be like this middle ground of thinking they're spiritual, like they can. And I think that's another one of the word distinctions, is that they can understand that there is this feeling of greatness or otherness that they can't define about something like the ocean or the wind, or like, things that might be considered religious, but nowadays we consider maybe more spiritual, and I think that's the word difference. Like, I would be interested to know what Richard Dawkins thinks of just take it out of the context of rules and...
Yeah, no, absolutely. And great point. And so you're already anticipating kind of complications down the road of how do these things all fit together, and if this is the religious feeling, does it really need to happen in a church? And so those are all important questions, but already our conversation has gotten richer, first of all. There's one other thing I wanted to say. Once we have that as part of the conversation, though, that people feel, and that there is this human capacity, desire to intuit the nature of the universe, that is something that's on offer in religions. That is the part of the attraction, and that's what we have to recognize as part of what's going on at church. So if we take the Christian church example, if you don't have feeling as part of what's happening there, then someone like Dawkins thinks that what happens at church is somebody gets up and stands up and says, the world is this old and this is the reality of God. And it's just all these factual claims
Yeah.
which are against science. But what's actually happening is some kind of culturally controlled and ritualized and choreographed way of coming to this feeling.
And I think that sparks memories as a kid of me feeling like I was missing out on that, knowing that I had a longing to fit into the universe in some way that was other than myself
Right.
and scientific.
Yep.
But we didn't go to church or
Yeah.
other than your explorations of being interested in
Right.
religion,
Yep.
which is important. But I think even as a kid, I knew that I was jealous or envious of people who did have something like that
Right.
in their life.
Right. Yeah. Because you feel like it's not, you weren't, so if we just put it in these Dawkins terms, you didn't feel like you were missing out on the right story about the factual nature of the universe.
Yeah.
You felt like you were missing out on some kind of communion with other people. So it's just a social element.
Well, even less than that, because I think Dawkins would feel like that was an explanation about tribalism or...
Right. No, right.
Because I felt like I had places to fit in, like basketball or...
Right.
You know.
So it was a different kind of
activity. It wasn't
activity.
social. It was something like bigger than that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I came across, I think maybe to wrap up this Schleiermacher religion is feeling part, which I think just on its own actually shifts the conversation radically. There's a great poem by Walt Whitman, who's an American poet, Leaves of Grass. A lot of people have heard of Walt Whitman, but he's something of a mystic himself. Like so, and he's got this poem, which I think makes this point precisely, called "When I Heard the Learned Astronomer," is the name of the poem. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured, with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became, tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars.
To me, there are many ways that that's moving, but it just makes me think of leaving college for something, just because it was so based on fact and education but to me there was something so much deeper about life and the world,
right,
that it's not enough to be educated. It feels like I'm lacking as a human if it's just facts and education.
Yeah, exactly. So I think William James and Schleiermacher are trying to bring that to the conversation and Walt Whitman, that there's something impoverishing about the scientific worldview if that's the end of the story. If it's just the facts and columns and graphs, we're missing something crucial. So it's a perfect Schleiermacher type poem. It's Walt Whitman saying, if you just close stars down to what science can say, you've missed out on something crucially important. And then the kind of question I'd love to ask Dawkins is, how do you square those two, even as it relates to truth? So yes, good. I don't want to forget this point. Why and how would the graph and column version of the stars, the counting, the factual, be truer than the Walt Whitman or anybody's sentiment looking up at the night sky? Why isn't that as true about the stars as the so-called factual stuff? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think about that kind of thing a lot, and it makes me think of Mom. You said to bring her back up. But I often hear Mom say to you, I know you might think that, but my experience is this. And she doesn't see how, like, quote unquote religious people might feel that way. But to her, it's like, I'm experiencing this. So whatever you're thinking or having facts about this, I know my experience to be true.
Yep. Yeah, I struggled a lot, actually. I decided kind of to leave it out. I mean, it'll come up later, I think, especially when we talk about psychedelics. That you're right, exactly right, that what Dawkins misses about this objective description of the universe is that human beings, as these two thinkers are telling us, we're in relationship with the universe, and our experience is as factual. I mean, it happens, right?
Yeah.
Now, again, I'm sympathetic to Dawkins in the sense that human beings also will take their experience and then they'll do bad science. They'll say, and I'm going to lay this over the nature of the world and don't tell me the world's round or whatever.
Yeah.
And this is part of why we're having this conversation, because it needs to be richer than this competition of claims about factual things. But I want to emphasize that human experience is a kind of truth terrain. There's truth to be had in experience.
Well, and you mentioned around Earth, which I feel like I can't let go.
Yeah, sure.
But I think it's an important thing that's going on in our culture today of, which I was going to say about science, was it's hard to disprove something without proving something else. And so, like, people's experiences, it's hard to disprove somebody's experience without saying to them, well, actually, this is what I proved to counter your experience.
Yes.
And with the flat Earth thing, people are having a hard time. They can't understand the science about around Earth, so they feel like they have to disprove it. And in their disproving experience of this round Earth theory, they're having to come up with a different story about the Earth, which kind of gets in the way of their belief in the first place, because then they can't prove their belief about it. But I think that's kind of the mucky waters that science gets into, is that it's hard to disprove something you can't prove in the first place. Right. Do you kind of get what I'm saying?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Yes. No, absolutely.
And then you're left to tell stories about what you've experienced.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit related to this scientism piece, that part of what goes wrong, I think, about in the belief and value column from science is it tries to limit the stories, what else you can say. It tries to say the only real things you can say about the world are the things that science can prove through this certain method. But we know as human beings that we work with so much other knowledge than that. And then people have trouble stitching it all together. How do these things get along? Okay. I am going to move now. Oh, yeah, sorry. I was getting confused by my notes. I just actually have the subtitle here. I don't really have any contents, but on my paper. I have it in my head. So I'm going to move to another thinker. So this guy's name's Peter Berger.
Okay.
He's a sociologist of religion. So he uses 20th century sociological scientific method to just look at what people are doing when they engage in religious activity. And there's a book called Sacred Canopy, and it's a weird book in the sense that his main thesis is just to claim that human beings have this tendency to do a certain kind of thing when it comes to metaphysics. So again, we're taking metaphysics to be factual claims about the nature of the universe. And to just kind of do it in a nutshell, the core idea is in the title, Sacred Canopy. So canopy means in this case, I mean, it's like, the idea of a canopy, something over the bed, right? It's like we live under this kind of umbrella that covers all of reality. And it's sacred because we think it's the truth, kind of the essential truth of of the universe itself. So now I'm speaking very abstractly, but and so what he wants to point out is that this human animal, at least by his study, likes to take their values and make it part of the nature of the universe itself. So we take ways of thinking about the world, ways of acting in the world, and to kind of valorize them, we say, oh, and here's a story about why these values are the only ones, the essential ones, the ones to pay attention to. Mm-hmm. So in Christianity and Judaism, if you use the Bible, there's this God that creates the world, wants us to be moral. The human being is at the center. Human being learns the value of good and evil. Eventually the God of that story gives them the 10 Commandments. And so there is this sense that 10 Commandments are not enough on their own. You can't just say to people, hey, let's follow these rules. There does seem to be this need to say, these rules are from on high. They're in the nature of things. They've been handed to us by God. Is this making sense?
Yeah.
And this is where metaphysics comes back into the story, because if you're trying to valorize your way of living and you want to root it in the nature of the universe, you're going to tell stories about the nature of the universe. So kind of like a little tiny example of this is if you take a mythical culture or a polytheistic culture, an animist culture that like reveres a mountain as a kind of god or talks about a mountain as a god, right? So they're not trying to, it's not like a science maneuver. They're not saying this is the physical nature of the mountain. They're using the power of the mountain and the stories they organize around it to say these values we live by are embedded in the reality around us.
Right.
And so that's crucially important, I think, for understanding why someone like Dawkins, who doesn't care about, or who wants to refute those stories because they seem to compete with the science story, is missing the role they play. And so this is not to say it's not complicated and difficult how you sort these things out, but we need to know that about human beings, that human beings want to embed their values. I think Dawkins himself does this in a kind of classical, modern, Western way. I mean, did you get a sense from the conversation of deep values he has besides science, like human values, like how we should treat each other? Any hints about how we should treat each other?
You can point that out.
No, think about it. Like when he criticizes this Islamic country that had that killed gay people, what is he saying value-wise?
Well, I mean, not to kill.
Right.
Yeah.
Where do you think that comes from for him? If we had to guess, like I'd love it if he were asked.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he kind of did mention, can't remember the word he used, but just something about, it was something along the lines of indoctrinating kids with.
Oh, yeah.
And I know that was from a religious standpoint, but to me, if I were to respond for Dawkins, it would be the values I was taught from when I was a kid.
Yeah. No, and he
rather than something intrinsic or deep within the human.
Well, that's what I would love to ask him about, because certainly he would say, yes, I've learned these values from my culture.
Yeah.
What I think if you pressed him a little bit, and to kind of just expand out about human rights in general. So there is this idea that comes to be in a certain culture, we're in it, where human rights is a thing to be valued.
Yeah.
If you ask people where those values come from or how deep they are, I think people's inclination is to say they are objectively true values, that they're not actually created by us for a certain time. It is a fact of the universe that people are equal. It is in the nature of things that we should treat each other the same. That is, to me, not a scientific claim at all. It is, Dawkins is making a value claim that people should be treated such and shouldn't be treated in this way. And if you pressed him for what's the valorization, where does that come from? He would say, we've learned that that's the nature of things. Like it's out, those values are out there, which as a scientist, I think he can't say. He's moved from fact arguments with religion to his own values to judge religion, but those values he takes to be in the nature of things just as other religious people do. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes sense, but I think for some reason my thinking is different than you about that, just because, and I've noticed this with veganism also, is that people like to explain the way they're already living and then shape their values around those things.
Right.
And to me, what he would probably say about that is, well, actually, as a scientist, it doesn't matter. I don't think we are intrinsically, and maybe I agree with this too. I'm not sure, but there's not actually something objectively, or how do I say this? There's not actually something wrong with killing. There's just something wrong with killing without reason that I agree with. So maybe he would say the indoctrination was that, oh, you shouldn't kill somebody just because they have different sexual preferences than you. That would be a taught value.
Right.
But it's okay to kill if it's fighting for America or something, which is something people believe in America.
Yeah.
So there's actually, to me, there's not something wrong with killing just from a human standpoint. It's killing without reason that I agree with.
Sure. No, that was well said. And then that gets into like just ethical perspectives and argumentation. Right. The point I want to make about Dawkins is and not everybody agrees with this point, but and even some famous kind of famous in the culture atheists would argue with what I'm about to say. But my point about Dawkins is the should. So if you use the word should, so should can only be cannot be validated scientifically. So I think this is part of what you're saying. So if somebody is killed for a particular reason that we find objectionable, you should not do that.
Yeah.
We have science can't sort that out.
The should.
Yeah. So here's a culture that says this person should be killed. Here we are saying that person should not be killed. Or with veganism, this animal should or should not be killed. Mm-hmm. The should comes from somewhere else. We can use a lot of, we have to be careful, as you were saying, about using fact to explain our should. Yeah. We have to be careful about those boundaries. But I would love to press Dawkins on his own should. Like, where does that should come from? And I think if you push a little bit, he would start to get into what I'm saying is religious territory of grounding our values in the nature of the universe. Mm-hmm. So he engages in that same activity. He just has freed himself from what we normally think of as religion. But he's engaging in the same kind of thing. All right. I think we're doing okay. Yeah, I think we're doing okay. Because I think we're coming to, this is kind of a catch-all, but my last big category, so we have religion as feeling, we've talked about experience, we talked about sacred canopy, which is our word for this kind of tendency to put value into the nature of things. And then the last thing I want to talk about, which is a phrase that comes from William James, is the reality of the unseen. The reality of the unseen. And I think Dawkins just kind of fails miserably on this front and lacks imagination for what things we should take as real. I think part of his scientism is to only take physical things as being real. Mm-hmm. And I think the question we have to explore is, in what way are immaterial things real? So I have a note here to do it. Just say a little bit more about varieties of religious experience, which is the James book. So I think I should add this. James, towards the end of the book, when he steps back and he starts to do some theorizing, he comes up with this very simple definition of religion, but I think a really powerful one. So he puts it this way: the most general definition of religion is the belief that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves to the unseen order. There's an unseen order. The good for us is to be in some harmonious relationship or adjusting to that unseen order. Does that make sense on the face of it? And it's a nice little quick umbrella. It's like all religions do that. All religions are saying unseen part of the universe, whether that's gods or experiences or values, or we'll talk a little bit more about what unseen thing means, and that we have to figure out a relationship to it. Does that make sense as a possible definition of religion?
Yeah, I think it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, so pretty simple, but maybe powerful, and then might help this conversation about religion in general. And he actually has another ways of formulating this, so I think these are helpful as well. He ends up talking about the unseen. He actually clarifies it a little bit too. He calls it the more, more, that just the view that there's something more, something bigger, something extra human. So not just unseen order, an invisible thing here or there, but there's an unseen moreness. It's bigger than us, and that's the thing we need to come to some kind of harmonious relationship with. Or as he puts it, in simple, again, a wonderfully simple phrase, how to be at home in the world. How to be at home in the world. And from the, Dawkins' strict, cold, scientific version of being at home, well, it wouldn't be a home, right? The science version is a house in the world. It's like, how do you...
He's afraid of going out his front door.
Did he say that?
No, but...
That's what you're saying.
That's how I feel about his mind.
Right.
In his home in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, Joe, I do want to point out too, and I think we've been skirting around this. There could be more to say, but Joe did have on offer a lot of time. Like, religion seems to give us a structure, explains things. And I think that's true. I think it's a little, it needs to be, it's a little deeper than just structure, which is, I guess, what we're saying right now. Like a house and some food and a fire is structure, but it's not a home.
Yeah.
What makes the universe a home? And religion, and I think for James, just being human, means we feel at home when we come to some relationship with an unseen more. So that'll it's very abstract in general, but I think that's where we're headed with James. I
was just going to say something that's on my mind that I just think is kind of funny, but it makes me think about how, Richard Dawkins talked about it a little bit, and I see it in the news all the time, how it says kids, like, younger generations are less and less religious. But there's this weird thing going around in the spiritual world of saying, I'm not from this universe, or I'm not from this planet, which just made me think about being at home in the universe.
Right.
Like,
interesting.
People thinking, I must be from somewhere else if I can't find a way to fit myself in here.
Yeah, exactly. And so maybe this gets back to the shareable world idea in general. Like, if we're headed into a future that has all, and Dawkins is right that institutional religion is on the decline, and as you're talking about with young people, but it doesn't, what these thinkers that we're talking about are saying is, don't think that religion was the problem, or once it's gone, you have a home, and that, exactly. So, wow, I didn't know about this trend.
It's not a, I don't feel comfortable here. It's I'm literally from a planet this many light years away. Yep.
Yeah. So but it speaks directly to, if you don't feel at home in the world you find yourself in, you find one, right? And is it a sign of the crises that we're facing that this is now the trend that people are thinking, well, if this can't be home, then it's somewhere else. It's not even here.
Yeah.
Wow. Which is why it's so important that we think about these things more carefully than Dawkins does.
And to me, it sounds like a religion. Like, to me, my personal definition of religion, I wouldn't put into words, but to me, that sounds like if you're saying you're from a different planet and this is what my planet believes in, and that's why I'm from there, sounds like a religion.
So belief in an unseen to other people,
Yeah.
right? So it's you're claiming something, a relationship to something nobody else can check by evidence, and you're trying to be in some kind of harmonious relationship with that thing, so that you have a home. Yeah, wow. Well, and so just to add, this just like will help what we just said, but the last thing I have for how James thinks about religion is he also has this other definition of religion, that it's there to solve a problem for us. So, I mean, the way he puts it, and Joe brings this up too at a certain point, he mentioned kind of just being existentially needy, that we just, as human beings, we are searching, whether it's for this being at home or whatever. And so to think of that just as a problem, like if you were completely content with the world, you wouldn't need religion. But here we all are kind of searching. And so the formulation James comes up with, again, super simple, is there's a problem with being human, and religion, if nothing else, offers a solution, says to people, we can solve that problem for you. So in religion, there is a kind of work that's being done. And so the phrase, that little formulation James comes up with is, if you're into religion, there's this kind of story, this is who I was, this is who I became, and the more had something to do with it. This other unseen thing turned me from what I was into what I became. And so there's work being done. And so I think we're going to do as much as with this. This is going to be a little kind of a thin explanation. There could be so much more to be said. But to come back to the kind of subtitle for this section, this is the reality of the unseen piece. James was what's in philosophy is called a pragmatist. What that means is, things are out there by the work they do. So what James sees in all these accounts in the book, where he's all these case studies, is story after story of work getting done, in the sense that people change. I went from being this kind of person to this kind of person, and my participation in this religion with these unseen forces made that transformation. There's a remind me of a story. So Joe Rogan has this interview with a boxer named Tyson Fury. Does that ring a bell at all? I don't know if you've seen this one. It's kind of fascinating. He's a British boxer.
Well, I know the name because his little brother was on Love Island.
Perfect. Okay. So he's in the cultural ether. He was quite accomplished heavyweight. He then goes off the rails. He is an alcoholic. He eats way too much. He tells this whole story to Joe because he comes back and he has a big fight, and so the whole world's watching, and Joe's a huge boxing fan. And so he's telling the story of having sunk really low and then coming back on this comeback trail. And in the story, Tyson Fury, so up to 400 pounds, alcoholic, keeps saying, I'm going to get my act together, never gets his act together. And then he tells this very moving story about dropping to his knees one night, crying, says my t-shirt was soaked with tears. I was praying. He says, I've always prayed, but I've never cried, and I've never begged God to help me. And so here I am on my knees, weeping, begging God to help me. And this change comes across me. Now, I've heard Joe reference that story in other podcasts, and he makes light of, or forgets, or just doesn't understand, I think, the transformation Fury felt in that moment as something he did not do. Joe, when maybe I've only heard him reference it once, but he says something like Fury got his act together, or he decided he would make a comeback, as if he were in control. And it's very clear if you listen to Fury's story, the whole point of it is to say, I'm not in control. Alcoholics Anonymous has this. Alcoholics Anonymous, to the degree that it's religious and it was shaped by some religious people, it's all about, I cannot be in control anymore. Something else, something unseen, bigger, more needs to change me because I can't do it. So to come back to the reality of the unseen, someone like William James would say, it is undeniable, even from a scientific point of view, just descriptively, you cannot get around the fact that what a person is reporting to you, that you can't study with any other instruments, you just must listen to the person's report. Tyson Fury had the experience of being transformed from the outside by a religion that he had some experience with already. He prayed, he probably had some kind of belief in God, so he did the actions, had the right factual views of the nature of the universe, if you will. But something transformed him. For William James, social scientist, smart guy, you have to let that thing be real.
Yeah.
It's immaterial. It can't be seen. It can't be poked at by science the way physical reality is. But it's just happening all over the place. Yeah. And James thinks this, I think it's part of the you don't understand religion if you're not understanding what's going on at a human level. And at the human level of experience, you get report after report that what happens to me when I'm engaged in religious activity, a person would say, is I'm being impacted by the more. It's not, it's something out there. So I'd love to know what Dawkins would say to something like this. It's like, does he think? So what I would emphasize with something like Dawkins is it's having real world effects.
Well, can I be his
advocate
sure.
Oh,
for
you
a
bet.
minute?
You bet.
Just because, for me, transformation even... Are you saying transformation is when you feel out of control is religious or religion? Like, because when you say transformation in a moment, to me, I guess this definition that you just read was saying that it's the more, it's the unseen.
Yeah.
But like, to me, to think about, and I'm just thinking of transformations in my life.
Yeah.
But just the moment I went vegan, what is that?
Right.
But I wouldn't have said it's religion.
Yeah. No. Good question. Yes.
Because I think a lot of people would listen and think, oh, there's a lot of transformations in life that we can't explain or we can't put a finger on.
Yeah.
But not a lot of people would explain that as religion all the time.
No, good question. So it's not what's always happening with transformation. We go through lots of important transformations without it being religious in this sense. So if we come back to the James definitions we were reading through, it's religious when there is this experience of an unseen more. It has to be part of it.
I guess what I'm saying is a lot of transformations are an unseen more. But if there's some that are religious and some that aren't, that means that it's not just a religious phenomenon.
Yeah.
To me, that makes it non-religious. Like, I know that seems backwards from your thinking.
Well, so it's a great clarifying question. And it would take a while, I think, to sort it out. But to emphasize what James is saying, just take it in the religion direction. So let's not worry now about how much experience it covers. But if you work backwards from that definition to religion itself, what's happening when Buddhists are prostrating to the Buddha? What's happening when Christians ask for Jesus to come into their life?
So you're saying that religion is facilitating that?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's cultivating, okay, so let's come back to the home run, right? Joe, it's a home run if you are thinking about the factual claim of a certain God being in the universe in a certain way. But if you shift to this experience, which I insist is just as real, is just as important, but that there's something being accomplished in each religion. So all of those gods, all those theisms are ways of talking about the more that allows you to come into relationship with it, that allows the transformation. So for Tyson Fury on his knees weeping for change, it could have been Zeus or Odin that Joe mentions.
Yeah.
And so the point is not you see what I'm saying. It's not the figure itself. It's that relational, transformational thing which can be, which all religions are trying to cultivate for us.
Yeah.
And if religions aren't doing it, this is part of the point I would make about why this is important in general for culture. If religions aren't doing it, what's doing it?
Yeah, it's still an unseen.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was thinking I wouldn't say this, but I think part of the story of the West and of America is that consumerism is a kind of spending the energy of how can it be a home? I can buy more things that do a certain thing for me, or so it's a very powerful tool, and it maybe kind of for some listeners gets too quickly away from religion itself, but yeah, I want to push this idea that we need to be careful about how we think about religion, because it might help us think about quite a lot of things.
Yeah.
I was gonna bring up, if I were going to talk about you in particular, well, maybe two things in your life. One, the veganism. I think you are very.
God.
Don't worry. No. You have a very deep and emotional connection to animals.
Yeah.
You have, it is a feeling level for you. You are not, although you engage in arguments of fact and value and just straight up, like, how can you do that to an animal? I think it comes from a communion you have with nature. You feel in communion with animals. So there's a feeling, so that it's not necessarily the transformational thing we were just talking about, but in terms of maybe it's more Schleiermacher, like of intuiting the universe. You think there's a connection being made to the universe through relationship with animals.
Yeah.
So it's a deep experiential feeling thing.
Yeah.
Out of which your values and maybe even metaphysical scientific claims come from.
Yeah.
But then more specifically on religion, your little Kali Ma episode, do you want to tell people what, am I saying it right? Kali Ma? Yeah.
Well, I mean, she's a Hindu goddess.
Right.
But
why did she become important for you? What kind of goddess is she, and why do you feel attracted to that?
She's interested in justice, and injustice in a way that's not always peaceful. And I think she fit an archetype for me that I didn't see growing up. And it made me, to put it in the context of the quotes, feel at home in the universe, to see an archetype that was like me.
Yep.
And, to feel the moment of transformation that I couldn't describe, of knowing that my way of being was correct for me. Yep. Which, growing up didn't always feel like maybe I'm doing it wrong. Maybe I'm not the right type of human. Right. So I would say, I would never describe myself as not religious. Just because I do think that those transformations to me are religion. Like to decide that I fit into the universe in a way that I didn't before. Yeah. Is religious. But yeah, I think obviously religion comes in many different forms, and I think that's what's important about what you study and know about the world. Yeah, and so just great, perfect. And so then I'm just going to echo what you said and put it in the terms of the things we've been talking about. I see your Kali Ma as, so you said archetype, and that's a super important word for some people who study religion. But part of
without going into all of that about where that word comes from, when we say archetype, I think one thing you're saying is that it's something out in the world.
Yeah.
And so who knows what Dawkins would think of archetypes. Maybe he would think it's helpful for thinking about consciousness or something. He almost certainly wouldn't say it's part of the nature of the universe. He would say it's something that the brain, oh man, I want to talk about the brain stuff too. The brain produces these, whatever. But your experience is awakening, as you put it, you felt more at home in the world by thinking that something you yourself experience is in fact part of the nature of reality. Mm-hmm. So Kali Ma becomes an externalization into a goddess of something you feel, but it's also a validation from the goddess that, don't worry, my dear, this is something that's right to feel. Yeah. I am that force.
Yeah. And deeper than, and I know this is what you're saying, but just to put it in my word, deeper than just you alone. Like, right. There is something ancestral or, and I don't mean ancestry in the way of relating, but something that goes back beyond your creation. Yep. That is deep within you.
Yep, exactly. And so to come back to the home run business, not to harp on that too much, if you were in a discussion with Dawkins about the importance of Kali Ma to you, so from his scientistic perspective, he would want to disabuse you of that idea. No, this goddess doesn't exist. Why not that god, atheism, et cetera, et cetera.
I think what he would say more is that you felt like you had a tribe. Like that.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Well, he'd have a maybe way of explaining why that worked for you. Yeah. But he would want to deny what you feel to know by experience, that it's something in the universe. And that's why, I guess that is a kind of explanation of archetype, that you found that within Hinduism, and you were in Bali, so you were surrounded by some Hinduism. There are similar figures in Buddhism and other religions, that fierce warrior approach to justice, the feminine force, et cetera, is the thing that's important about the god or goddess. Yeah. And it can get represented differently. Yeah. That's what an archetype, right? Yeah. Exactly. All right. Well, I do think we should not be too much longer, but let's see how. So I want to make hopefully maybe some quick points. I want to jump to the placebo stuff. So, did you have any thoughts about? Do you understand placebo effect?
And it's funny that there was nothing bigger for him to explain about that.
Yes, say more.
The whole fascination with the placebo is there's something greater than our scientific belief about medicine or healing or physical ability. That there's something other than that's happening that can't be explained. Right. It's unseen.
Right. No, I'd love to push Dawkins a little bit on this point, because he so willingly accepts the placebo effect because it's studied in a scientific way. Yeah. Like it is a scientifically established thing. The next question is, what does it show us about the world? Yeah. It shows us that people's ideas, the immaterial, unseen part of human experience, can heal the physical body. Yeah. It should blow his mind. Yeah. That placebos are possible. And he did have that one moment where he said, so he was like, well, I'm quite comfortable with the fact that if somebody doesn't know they're getting the real medicine, that they get healed. And then somebody brought up that even if you say this is a placebo, he's like, I really don't get that one. But I don't think you should get either one. He shouldn't. There's something to come to terms with. So science has offered us something through its own method that should confuse someone like Dawkins, who's scientistic, thinks that the physical reality, is kind of the whole story, that consciousness is epiphenomenal. So I assume he thinks that consciousness just comes late in the story of human evolution. It just sits on top of all this physical stuff. And yet what the placebo effect is saying is people's mental life, their expectation, their attitude can have this profound effect on the body and transform it utterly. It's crazy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we talked about the homeopathic part of that earlier, which I think homeopathy is a kind of mixed story about. It may not just be placebo, but even if it were just placebo, that should be a shocking thing in itself.
Yeah.
That things can have that power.
Yeah. He lets a lot of things go unexplained.
Right.
But isn't comfortable with the religious belief of letting some things just be as they are.
Yeah, and then I have this other note. I had a similar note earlier, and so maybe it's a thread that won't make a lot of sense. But I just, if you now just jump over to religion from the placebo effect, and I think if we work James, and now I hope this is a clear point, but and so it's also a little bit of a pushback against Joe and just having structure. And we talked earlier about how structure is not enough. And so if you think about being at home in the world, being a human being, having to deal with grief, wanting more joy, all those more human things, science, in Dawkins' sense, and our culture has done this, can maybe offer us chemical manipulation. Like, you want to feel better, you want to feel less grief. Here are manipulations of your chemistry, which we know don't work very well and have their own problems. Or, this is the reality of the unseen thing again, like, can this thing we're calling religion generally, where you're cultivated to think certain things about the world, to behave, engage in certain ritual activities, ways of thinking, can transform you utterly, just the way a placebo does. That it can lead to joy, it can help you with grief. These profoundly human things need to be thought about more, and to understand religion's power to have those effects.
Yeah.
And so for someone like Dawkins to come along and just say, nope, don't do that because it conflicts with this scientific claim, or and I guess I also do want to say on Dawkins' side, and this comes back a little bit to that I'm a fan of science as well. Towards the end, he talked about how this book is kind of meant for kids, and he wants it to be a counter to indoctrination, which you brought up earlier, and I wholeheartedly agree with that people, we need to be critical thinkers. Schleiermacher was too. He did so, and James, he did. In some ways, I think they were being more scientific than Dawkins is being, because they're being open to what experience and the world can tell us. And so, yes, I'm against indoctrination. I'm against a dogmatic belief. I'm for critical thinking, and that's why religion needs to be a richer thing to think about.
Yeah, and I think that idea of indoctrination or extremism to me came up when I was living in Missouri, of feeling so anti the people who were so deeply religious, that it almost became religious to me to disagree with them.
Right.
And I think that's a little bit of what Mom has too.
But when you say religious there, now that we can be careful about these words, you mean dogmatic and ideological, that you're committed to a position and not open to the conversation.
Yeah.
Yep.
I guess.
Which may not be religious in these terms.
Yeah. Practicing a particular religion, maybe. Can I say that?
But dogmatically. So Schleiermacher has given us this gift of how to think about religion because he had the poet friends and he had rich ways of thinking about things.
Yeah.
You do, I think this is something we won't talk a lot about here, but this is a big conversation. And this is part of the shareable world part of all of this, is religion does have this tendency to shut out.
Yeah.
But if you're a critic of religion, talk about that problem of religion, which Schleiermacher actually thought was not inherent to religion. That's a different kind of problem. And he actually thought that if you focused on the feeling level, the intuition of the universe and so forth, you actually are naturally more tolerant. I think that's what Joe means about the ocean.
Yeah, which is something I like about Asia, or like the Eastern way of approaching religion, which may not be true in every case, of course, but what I've experienced is that it's less about, at least when I was living in Bali, it's less about the rules for them of their religion. Mm-hmm. They'll accept anybody, any Westerner who might be living a little bit differently than they might, and more about this like deeper feeling of connectiveness,
right?
That is important to them, and that feeling they want to share or invite people to try to feel with them. But nobody ever talked to me about the rules of being,
right? Or the metaphysical stuff, the factual stuff, like you're getting this, you should think this and not that. It's more about attitude and feeling and
and even like I feel like I could conversationally understand what was going on just in Bali based on language, and nobody ever tried to tell me the rule,
right.
Whereas in America, that seems very important to the religious story.
And boy, this is another big potential topic. I'm only going to touch on it here, but it's fascinating to me, and that is the interconnections between Christianity and science, and a certain attitude towards truth, which is part of the religious heritage of Christianity and its relationship to science. So the kind of punchline being, there's something in particular about Christianity that makes it less flexible. So if we think about what you just described as a kind of flexibility about thought with an emphasis on feeling, or whatever you want to call it, there's a kind of built-in inflexibility with Christianity, precisely because it argues that Jesus appeared at a certain place and time and has a specific relationship to all of us finding a home, right? Like it's a master grand narrative that is a little more pushy about the truth parts in the scientific sense. Jesus was in this particular place at a certain time. The flexibility, I think, of what you were experiencing, you see this in Buddhism also. The Buddhists, in fact, most, even, just slightly sophisticated Buddhists would say, it kind of doesn't matter whether the Buddha really existed or not. Here are the teachings. Here's what this Buddhist cultural practice has on offer to you. Are you uncomfortable in life? Would you like greater joy? Are you not at home? Think about these ideas. Examine your own mind. Find your own way. And there's all sorts of Buddhist stories about the Buddha himself being flexible in his teachings. It's kind of inbuilt inflexibility that I think gets translated to science itself. In Christianity, where it's no, you must assent to these propositions. There's the thinking part. If you don't think these things, you can't be doing the Christian thing.
Interesting.
Yeah. All right. Okay, it's on my paper. I'm going to make one final point. Is this one final point? And it is more a historical point about where we find ourselves. So I just made a historical point about something that may be particular to Christianity. The historical point I want to end with is the diversity of thought in the world in general. So this all came together for me when somebody was pointing out, probably in some lecture about Christianity, that Peter Berger, who wrote The Sacred Canopy, also has a book called The Heretical Imperative. Heresy. So heresy means when you think against the church. But now it also means when you think against the normal doctrine. heresy etymologically, meaning the origin of the word, I'm told, it just means choice. So in the Christian context, the church is saying you should think this. And if you decide to think something else, you've chosen against the church.
Right.
The thesis of this book, The Heretical Imperative, is that we live in an age where there's so much diversity of thought that we have to choose.
Yeah.
And that historically, that's a really recent thing. If you were born in medieval Europe, the world was Christian. Like it wasn't a church on the corner offering you this way of thinking. That was it. You were, and so Buddhist and Hindu and the history of the world is people being born into a way of thinking. And therefore, it's quite natural to just assume that's the nature of the universe. This is a world that was created by the Christian God and that Jesus was born into, because that's the only story. It explains everything.
Yeah.
Or the Buddha, or Kali Ma, or pick your God. Now we live in a world. So in other words, it was easy to take it as true. It was taken for granted.
Yeah.
Now we live in a world where we know the options, we know the choices, and yet we're choosing between things that got shaped to be taken for granted.
Yeah.
And so to become a Christian means to step into this master story that wants you to take it for granted that that's the way that things are. And yet we have the consciousness that this is one story and there are many stories. And that kind of, in some ways, it undermines the power of religion.
Yeah.
Because it weakens the story. But it also, once again, reveals that we have this need to make our stories be the truth about things. And so I'm going to end this particular story about truth and taking for granted that there's another German actually named Nietzsche, who's a 19th century, 1800s German philosopher. And he thought about this problem a lot, and he analyzes it in the history of Western ideas. And in a way, he tries to say to us that the problem is not that serious. It's made serious by science. It's made serious by a certain concept of truth. And that what we need to do is weaken that concept of truth a little bit. And he talks about it and shifting from the idea that something is true with a capital T to thinking about a way of thinking about the world as if it were true. So the little as if phrase becomes super important. I want to live for a while as if Kali Ma is a real force in the world. I'm going to put a tattoo on my arm. I'm going to get a little statue. I'm going to think about her as if she is a real thing, which in some ways we've explained why she is a real thing. But the as if is super important.
Yeah.
And this comes back to the possible inflexibility of certain religions. It'd be very confusing, I think, to a Christian to think I'm living in the world as if Jesus Christ came and died for my sins. Nietzsche tries to make the point that that's really all we're ever doing is an as if. Go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like that's the way I thought people thought about the world. So it's news to me that
you would think otherwise.
But what do I even know for sure ever?
Right.
But it's about deciding what you want to choose, what you want to believe, and how that shapes the way you go about the world in that scenario.
Yep. So I think in a conversation about religion, certainly religious people would find this disorienting to think that what they're up to is an as if. But the other part of the Nietzsche story, which I think is just brilliant, is he points out that we do this all the time with art. So if you go to see Hamlet, you go to the theater to see a Shakespeare play, and it's Hamlet or whatever, you're watching Hamlet, and you come, and it's profoundly moving for whatever reason, and the next day you're talking to somebody, it's like, I saw Hamlet, and I was realizing this about life, and it made me reflect on this part of who I am. And, the whole thing with Ophelia was so just, blah. And then, if it were Dawkins sitting across from you, it would be, he would reach over and say, I got some disturbing news for you. Hamlet didn't exist.
Yeah.
Hamlet is not real.
Yeah.
There was this guy Shakespeare. It's almost like the Mormon story, right?
He thought it up.
He wrote it down. We found, right. He like corrected some stuff. Like we know where it came from. It's, that would be ridiculous too, right? It's like, no, of course. Because art is something else. And then of course, as I'm sure you're seeing, as it relates to religion, the art is as if I go to the play and I act as if this actor is this guy named Hamlet. And I act as if these things are happening to him. And I hear these words in that situation. And can be life changing.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because when I was going to school in Boise, I was having a debate about religion with somebody. And they said, well, if what I believe isn't true, then if what I believe is true, then I'm not going to hell and I will go to heaven. If it's not true,
right,
then I don't really care because it's made me a better person. And it was an as if, and I was like,
right.
Okay, cool.
Right.
I don't really mind what you believe then. If you're okay with it being either way,
right,
and the way it shapes you in the world is a benefit.
And I think so. Part of my hope for this conversation, and people who listen to it are interested in why Dawkins may not sound right to them or themselves religious, is that so. As it relates to as if, I think a lot of people, even though if you press them on the truth value of their religion, they want to say it's true. But I think they actually they're engaging in the as if all the time. And I think a lot of people actually even understand that. Like, I go to church on Sunday and I listen to the sermon. I'm in this space with the high ceiling, and this story about Jesus leads me to think in certain ways. And so Dawkins is just missing the boat entirely if he wants to shake that person and say,
don't do it.
Or the world is this old, or this God that you imagine with the beard in heaven isn't really there, and hell doesn't exist, and he's missing, it's like the Hamlet thing. It's like saying Hamlet's not real. And in a way, for me, as somebody who studies these things and teaches them, it's where the really rich stuff is, not in the science. Like it's where we think about how to be human and how to live and the important questions. And so to have someone come along and shake you and say, no, stop doing that, especially with not kind of, I was going to say without offering something else, although I'm sure, Dawkins would have things he would offer, right? Science and maybe some values that he's bought into that come from his culture. And in some ways, it, may be straightforward that way. I also think sometimes that they're just people with very different sensibilities. Like Dawkins just doesn't, human beings are very different, can be very different. And so just as a Shakespeare can come along and write these plays that are so rich with respect to human experience, and he's so interested in that and so good at it, Dawkins can come along who's very good at the science and just fine with like these explanations for things and doesn't need that intuition of the infinite and the feeling and but don't, oh man, I was going to try that modern expression of don't, it's like, don't rain on my parade. It's don't,
well, can't we say, don't ick my wow?
There you go. Don't ick my wow. Dawkins, stop icking people's wow. I mean, let's have a richer discussion, but don't walk around with this kind of crude in the sense of just kind of big criticism that's meant to take out all sorts of rich experience by icking people's wow. Should we end there?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Honey. That was
pretty
fun.
Good.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, I guess Mom will listen to it. maybe some other family members. But we'll
Yeah.
see if hopefully other people out there will be interested. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thanks.